May 5, 1945. Prague is burning. Church bells that had stayed silent for 6 years of Nazi occupation are ringing across the city. Barricades of paving stones and overturned trams are going up on every corner. Ordinary Czechs, bakers, students, tram drivers, are pulling rifles out of hiding places they'd kept sealed since 1939. In the middle of this chaos, a truck rumbles through the streets, carrying a 52-year-old man in a suit. He is being rushed, at gunpoint if necessary, toward a radio station still held by German forces. His captors, the same Nazis he has served for 6 years, want him to go on air and calm the uprising down. The truck runs out of fuel. The man steps out onto a street filled with people who despise him more than they despise the Germans themselves. He knows what happens if that crowd recognizes his face, so he takes out his pistol, puts it to his own head, and pulls the trigger. His name was Emanuel Moravec. 28 years earlier, he had been one of the most celebrated soldiers of the First World War, a man who charged into machine gun fire for the dream of an independent Czechoslovakia. By the time he died, his own countrymen had a different word for him: Quisling, traitor. The most hated Czech of the 20th century. This is the story of how a war hero became a collaborator and why his fall still haunts Czech memory 80 years later. Emanuel Moravec was born on April 17, 1893, in Prague, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was not born into privilege. He came up through an industrial school, not an aristocratic academy, a detail that mattered in an empire still deeply stratified by class. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Moravec, like millions of Czechs and Slovaks, was conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army and sent east to fight the Russians. For many Czechs, this was not their war. They had no loyalty to Vienna, and no desire to die defending an empire that had suppressed their national identity for centuries. Moravec's war took the turn that would define an entire generation of Czechoslovak patriots. He was captured by the Russians as a prisoner of war. Captivity should have ended his war. Instead, it began his legend. Inside Russian POW camps, thousands of Czech and Slovak prisoners were organizing themselves into a fighting force with a radical goal: an independent Czechoslovak state, carved out of the wreckage of Austria-Hungary. These volunteer units became known as the Czechoslovak Legions, and Moravec joined them. In July 1917, at the Battle of Zborov, the Czechoslovak Legion did something almost unthinkable. Fighting under Russian command against their former Austro-Hungarian rulers, against men who in many cases had once been their own countrymen, the Legion broke through fortified Austrian lines and won a decisive tactical victory. Zborov became an instant legend in Czechoslovak national memory, proof that Czechs and Slovaks could fight and win for their own flag. Moravec fought at Zborov. He returned home in 1918 not as a defeated conscript, but as a legionnaire, a member of the founding military myth of the new Czechoslovak Republic. In a country built on the idea that its soldiers had earned independence with their own blood, the legionnaires were untouchable heroes. Moravec was one of them. Roughly 40,000 to 60,000 Czechs and Slovaks eventually served in the legions across Russia, France, and Italy during WWI. A force built entirely from prisoners, defectors, and volunteers, with no pre-existing army or state behind it. Zborov, fought by a force of about 3,000 legionnaires against a numerically superior Austro-Hungarian position, remains one of the most mythologized single engagements in Czech military history. The interwar years were good to Emanuel Moravec. He built a serious career inside the new Czechoslovak army, eventually becoming a lecturer at the military university in Prague from 1931 onward. He was not just a soldier, he was an intellectual of the officer corps, a writer, a theorist, a public voice on military affairs. In 1933, he was promoted to colonel, and by 1936, he commanded an infantry regiment. More importantly, Moravec became one of the loudest and most respected voices arguing that Czechoslovakia must be prepared to fight Germany, with or without help from Britain and France. As Adolf Hitler's Germany grew more aggressive through the 1930s, Moravec was firmly in the camp of officers who believed capitulation was unthinkable. He was a public defender of President Tomáš Masaryk's legacy and when Masaryk died in 1937, Moravec was one of the pallbearers at his state funeral, a position reserved for the nation's most trusted figures. By 1938, Emanuel Moravec was, by almost any measure, one of the most patriotic, most hawkish, most respected military voices in Czechoslovakia. If you had asked anyone in Prague that summer to name the men who would never bow to Hitler, Moravec's name would have been near the top of the list. Then came Munich. In September 1938, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy signed the Munich Agreement, handing Czechoslovakia's heavily fortified border region, the Sudetenland, to Nazi Germany. Czechoslovakia itself was not even in the room when its fate was decided. For a country that had built its entire self-image around the courage of the Legionnaires of 1917, Munich was not just a territorial loss, it was a psychological collapse. The Western democracies that Czechoslovak leaders, like Edvard Beneš, had trusted to contain Germany, had simply given the country away without a shot fired. For Moravec, Munich shattered something fundamental. The man who had spent a decade arguing for armed resistance watched his own government stand down without fighting. And from that moment, his thinking began to shift in a direction that would define the rest of his life and destroy his legacy. He concluded that resistance was hopeless. If the great powers of Europe would not stand behind Czechoslovakia, then defying Nazi Germany was, in his mind, a fantasy that could only get more Czechs killed. Survival, he decided, meant accommodation. It is one of the darker ironies of this story. The man most associated with Czech collaboration did not start as a coward or an opportunist. He started as the opposite, and it was the trauma of betrayal by his own allies that pushed him toward betraying his own people. In March 1939, Germany occupied the remainder of Czech lands, establishing the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a puppet state under direct Nazi control, with a Czech figurehead president, Emil Hácha, presiding over what was in reality a colony of the Reich. Moravec did not resist. He collaborated, enthusiastically, publicly, and with the fervor of a true convert. He became a journalist and propagandist, using his credibility as a former legionnaire and respected officer to tell ordinary Czechs that loyalty to the Reich was their only rational path forward. This was, in propaganda terms, devastating. A collaborator with no history of patriotism is easy to dismiss. A collaborator who fought at Zborov, who carried Masaryk's coffin, who had spent the 1930s demanding resistance, that man's voice could reach people that German propagandists never could. In January 1942, under the reorganized Protectorate government installed by Reichsprotector Reinhard Heydrich, Moravec was appointed Minister of Education and National Enlightenment. He also chaired the Board of Trustees for the Education of Youth, a fascist-modeled youth organization designed to indoctrinate Czech children into loyalty toward the Reich, a role that placed him at the center of efforts to reshape the next Czech generation in the image of the occupiers. Moravec held the Education Ministry from January 1942 until the collapse of the Protectorate in May 1945, more than 3 full years at the heart of the collaborationist government, making him one of the longest-serving and most visible Czech officials of the entire occupation. He earned a nickname that would follow him into every history book written about this period, the Czech Quisling, a direct comparison to Vidkun Quisling, the Norwegian who became the era's global symbol of national betrayal. Not everyone accepted Moravec's transformation quietly. The Czechoslovak government in exile in London, running its intelligence operations through a man named František Moravec, no relation, but a bitter historical irony given the shared surname, considered Emanuel Moravec a priority target. František Moravec helped plan Operation Anthropoid, the 1942 mission that assassinated Heydrich himself. Alongside that operation, plans were also drawn up to assassinate Emanuel Moravec for his collaboration, a mark of just how seriously the resistance and the exile government treated the threat he posed. He survived those plots, but the war that he believed could not be won by resistance was in fact turning against Germany on every front. Stalingrad, Normandy, the collapse of the Eastern Front, and Moravec's entire justification for collaboration was crumbling along with it. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was finished. Soviet forces were closing in from the east, American forces from the west, and inside Prague itself, the population was preparing to do in 1945 what their government had failed to do in 1938, rise up and fight. On May 5th, the Prague Uprising began. Czechs who had endured 6 years of occupation took to the streets, seized radio stations, and built barricades across the city. For Emanuel Moravec, there was nowhere left to hide. He had bet his entire post-war future on Nazi Germany surviving, or at least on being remembered, as a man who had spared his country from destruction. Instead, he faced a city in open revolt, populated by people who saw him as the man who had sold them out for 3 years of ministerial power. German officials, in a final and almost absurd miscalculation, believed Moravec's voice could still calm the uprising, that his old reputation as a Legionnaire hero might reach a population now trying to kill collaborators in the street. They put him in a truck and sent him toward a Prague radio transmitter still under German control. The truck ran out of fuel before it arrived. Stranded, exposed, and certain that the crowd around him would show no mercy to the Czech Quisling, Emanuel Moravec shot himself. He died on May 5, 1945, just 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender ended the war in Europe. Unlike some Protectorate-era officials who were quietly rehabilitated after the war, Moravec's name never recovered. Czech historians largely avoided writing about him for decades, a silence that historian Jiří Pernis later attributed partly to shame and partly to a communist-era disinterest in revisiting that particular chapter of national humiliation. What makes Moravec's story so unsettling isn't that a coward became a traitor. It's that a genuine hero did. The same man who charged Austrian lines at Zborov in 1917, who buried Masaryk in 1937, who spent the 1930s demanding Czechoslovakia fight rather than surrender, became, within 4 years, the most notorious collaborator in his nation's history. Munich broke something in him that never repaired. And in trying to save his country through accommodation, he ended up as its most reviled symbol of betrayal, a warning, still cited in Czech political discourse today, about how quickly conviction can curdle into collaboration when a nation's allies abandon it at the moment it needs them most. He died on a street in the city he once fought to help liberate, at the hands of no one but himself, the final, fitting irony of a life that began as a legend and ended as a warning.